Imagine a bloodline so determined to protect itself that it sealed off the outside world and turned inward, generation after generation, until the only unions allowed were between brothers. Not cousins, not distant kin, but brothers joined to brothers, forging a cycle that lasted 7 full generations. This happened not in myth, but in the very real shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, where men carved out survival and bound themselves to each other with oaths written in blood. For more than 150 years, this legacy carried forward, while entire communities chose silence. What could drive men to repeat such a cycle? Was it fear of outsiders, or an obsession with purity and control? Tonight, we step into that darkness, into a world where brothers became both fathers and sons, and tradition became a prison of flesh and bone. Before we journey further, hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and share this video with someone who appreciates hidden history. It helps keep these stories alive and ensures I can keep bringing you more. The Appalachian Mountains were more than a landscape. They were walls of stone and forests that swallowed men whole. In those ridges, men could vanish, cut off from towns, laws, and the scrutiny of outsiders. Generations of men who settled there carried axes, rifles, and grudges. They were debtors, drifters, and fugitives, seeking ground that would never be claimed by landlords or sheriffs. The mountains promised silence, and silence was exactly what they desired. Among these men arose a particular bloodline that refused interference. They did not mingle with nearby clans, nor trade much beyond bare necessities. Brotherhood became their fortress, and they swore to bind themselves only to each other. At first, these men took neighbors into their circles, but suspicion crept in. They muttered about betrayal, theft of land, and invasion by outsiders. To protect themselves, they narrowed trust until it included only brothers and brothers alone. When towns expanded and railroads carved paths through valleys, most men adapted. But this bloodline tightened its grip, closing doors and refusing community. Brotherhood became doctrine, and from that point forward, only internal bonds were tolerated. The first brother-to-brother union was whispered among nearby hunters. Some men condemned it as unholy, others dismissed it as survival. Yet within the secluded cabins, it became precedent, a standard that generations of men followed without hesitation. From that moment, sons carried a burden they never asked for. They were born not to freedom, but to ritual, raised under rules written by fathers who enforced silence and obedience above all else. Those mountains shielded their secrets. Trails were difficult, weather unforgiving, and outsiders unwelcome. Few who stumbled too close lingered long. The ridges and hollows formed natural barriers that locked the brotherhood into an iron circle of secrecy. Inside cabins of rough-hewn logs, men forged their own scriptures. They declared that purity of blood meant loyalty to brothers, nothing else. Any betrayal, any bond with an outsider, was punished with exile, or worse, silent erasure from memory. Each son was taught early. His destiny was predetermined. He would carry his bloodline forward by binding himself to his brother. The cycle became so ingrained that choice no longer existed. Tradition ruled every decision. The cost appeared in the sons themselves. Many were frail, their bodies bent before their time. Some never spoke words, only sounds, haunting noises that echoed through the hollows. Yet the brotherhood accepted them as proof of survival. Neighbors knew. They saw boys who never learned to read, men who wandered aimlessly, hunters who communicated with guttural cries. Yet few dared to challenge the brotherhood. Fear and pity silenced outsiders, allowing the cycle to remain unbroken. In taverns, men whispered stories of pale figures glimpsed at tree lines. Some swore they heard unnatural laughter, others claimed to hear screams. But when officials were told, they shrugged, unwilling to enter mountains that swallowed men without trace. The silence was not ignorance, it was complicity. Men in nearby settlements decided the Brotherhood's practices were better left alone. They turned away, convincing themselves that interference would only bring misfortune to their own sons. And so, the Brotherhood endured. Every generation repeated the cycle, sons locked to fathers, brothers locked to brothers. The ritual hardened into iron tradition, leaving no room for rebellion, no chance of breaking free. What began as isolation slowly became doctrine. The mountains themselves seemed to whisper the rules. Keep outsiders away, bind only to brothers, carry the bloodline forward no matter the cost. To these men, it was not sin, but destiny. The land became both shield and prison. Cabins decayed, fields grew barren, yet the Brotherhood held fast. For them, purity mattered more than survival. Their pride lay not in prosperity, but in continuing a chain forged in secrecy. This was the soil where the story took root. In these mountains, silence fed tradition, and tradition bred tragedy. A brotherhood convinced of its own righteousness began a cycle that would last 7 generations, unchallenged and unbroken. The first true bond within the brotherhood did not appear suddenly. It was whispered into existence, a choice made when survival and suspicion collided. 2 brothers stood at the center, deciding that blood would never mingle with outsiders. At that time, their cabins were still new, rough shelters hacked from timber. Men hunted daily, fought storms, and tilled stubborn soil. Yet beyond these labors, one oath took hold. No outsider would ever claim their blood. The brothers' decision unsettled neighbors. Men in nearby hollows gossiped by firelight, asking why anyone would reject alliances. Marriages with neighbors secured land, livestock, and kinship. But these brothers declared that only bonds within their own line could endure. At first, men scoffed. They believed the brothers acted out of fear, perhaps pride. Yet as years passed, the oath hardened. Sons born of these unions were not mistakes. They were symbols of loyalty, carried proudly despite visible costs. Those early sons bore marks of the cycle. Some limped, some stammered, others grew with vacant eyes. Still, their fathers insisted these boys carried something sacred, something untouchable, a bloodline untainted by outsiders. Pride outweighed shame. It is said the first bond was marked not with celebration, but with secrecy. No preacher blessed it, no neighbor witnessed it. Only brothers stood in a cabin, sealing the pact themselves, away from the world. The impact was immediate. Outsiders noticed distance growing. Invitations to trade or hunt together were refused. Men who tried to draw the brothers outward found themselves unwelcome. The mountains swallowed the family into a darkness that grew deeper each season. For the sons, choice no longer existed. Each was raised under the command of his father and uncles. You will take your brother as your bond, as I have done before you. The rule became scripture. Outsiders began to whisper of a curse. They claimed the hills themselves had twisted these men, shaping their choices. Yet within the cabins, fathers told their sons it was destiny, not corruption, that demanded loyalty to brothers. This transformation was subtle but irreversible. Once the first bond was established, the pattern became a template. Every new generation of men was measured not by achievement, but by willingness to repeat the bond of his ancestors. Each son carried not only his father's blood, but his command. The cycle chained them tightly, denying escape. Even boys who wished to wander were pulled back, reminded that loyalty to the brotherhood outweighed personal desire. Neighbors continued watching uneasily. They saw boys raised in silence, kept close by fathers and uncles who never trusted outsiders. Rumors spread of strange rituals in the woods, where men repeated oaths under starlight, far from prying eyes. When county officials arrived, they were met by hostile stares. Brothers stood united at their cabins, rifles near the door, unwilling to answer questions. Outsiders eventually stopped asking, deciding the brotherhood's business was best left untouched. As decades passed, the first bond became legend among the men of nearby towns. Some condemned it, others treated it as cautionary myth. Yet all agreed, those brothers had chosen a path no outsider could ever change. The sons of those early bonds grew into men shaped by both ritual and deformity. Some were strong, others weakened, but each was marked by the oath. Their very bodies told the story of loyalty carried too far. Fathers instructed their sons with unwavering conviction. The blood must remain pure, they said. The bond between brothers is sacred. To break it is to betray your forefathers, to invite ruin upon us all. And so the first bond echoed forward like a stone dropped into still water. Every ripple reached further, until the entire lineage was caught in the expanding circle, bound to a choice made generations earlier. What began as one decision in a cabin of rough logs became the foundation of a brotherhood that endured for 7 generations. The first bond was not simply history, it was destiny, binding sons long after the first brothers were gone. The sons of the brotherhood were born into silence. Their cabins echoed with the weight of tradition, where every boy was told from his first breath that his destiny was already chosen. They carried not only their father's names, but their father's burdens. Each boy was raised to believe loyalty to his brother outweighed every desire, every dream. The chain was forged before their first steps. These sons bore the scars of the cycle. Some walked with crooked limbs, others spoke in fractured tones. A few never spoke at all, communicating through gestures and sounds that unsettled men who visited the cabins. Yet within the brotherhood, weakness was not shame. Fathers declared that every boy, no matter how frail, was proof that the blood endured. They lifted sons in their arms and praised survival above strength. The outside world saw something different. Men who passed through the mountains told stories of strange figures at tree lines, boys with vacant stares, boys who mirrored each other's faces until individuality seemed erased. Huntsmen whispered of eerie encounters. They described brothers who moved silently through the underbrush, watching with eyes too wide, too bright. Sons of the chain seemed less like boys and more like shadows carved from the same mold. In nearby towns, men debated what they had seen. Some swore the boys were cursed, others insisted they were simply uneducated. But all agreed the sons carried an aura that made outsiders uneasy, even fearful. Inside the cabins, fathers enforced silence. Boys who questioned their future were silenced with stern hands and harsher words. Tradition was not to be doubted. Obedience was demanded. Every son became another link in the chain. Some sons tried to resist. A boy might wander too far, chasing freedom in the woods. But he was always dragged back, told his blood was sacred, his destiny bound forever to his brothers. The cycle created sons who were both victims and enforcers. Once they grew into men, they repeated the same oaths, pressing the same rules upon their own boys, ensuring the chain remained unbroken. These generations of sons carried marks that outsiders could not ignore. Distinct features repeated across faces, narrow jaws, sharp cheekbones, eyes set oddly apart. Each boy resembled his father, his brother, his uncle, until they all appeared like one. Doctors who examined some of the sons recorded degenerative conditions. They wrote about weak bones, frail minds, and stunted growth. Yet they never dared state the cause outright. The truth was whispered, never declared aloud. Despite the hardships, fathers told their sons they were chosen. "Our line is pure," they said. "We are different from other men. That difference is strength." Boys were taught to embrace suffering as proof of honor. This twisted pride chained them tighter. A son born with deformities was not mourned, but displayed as evidence that the oath still lived. His survival, however fragile, became sacred, binding brothers to continue the cycle. The mountains carried the cries of boys at night. Some wailed in confusion, others in pain. Neighbors heard these sounds but chose silence. They told themselves the Brotherhood's suffering was their own business. By the fifth generation, the sons no longer questioned the chain. They repeated it like scripture, accepting it as destiny. Each boy grew knowing he was not free, but bound to the blood of his brothers. The tragedy of the sons was not only their frailty, but their obedience. They were born innocent, yet molded into enforcers of a doctrine that consumed them. Sons became fathers, and the chain lengthened, link by link. Thus, the sons of the chain lived and died in cycles of silence. Their story was not one of rebellion, but of inheritance, an inheritance no boy asked for, yet every son was forced to bear. The men who lived near the Brotherhood were not blind. They saw the strange sons. They heard the cries echoing through the hollows at night. Yet they chose silence, pretending nothing was wrong. Silence, however, was not ignorance. It was a decision born of fear, pity, and complicity. Neighbors told themselves that intervening would only invite danger, that confronting the Brotherhood would bring ruin to their own households. In small Appalachian settlements, privacy was sacred. Men respected boundaries, rarely pried into another man's home. But the Brotherhood's secrecy was something more, a wall built not just of timber, but of intimidation and unspoken threats. Hunters passing near the cabins spoke of hostile stares. Brothers stood on porches with rifles across their knees, watching in silence. Outsiders quickly learned that lingering too long could mean confrontation, or worse, disappearance. Some men whispered that the Brotherhood was cursed. They said God himself had marked their line for sin. Others insisted the land carried bad luck, and that disturbing the brothers would invite that curse home. Stories spread in taverns, carried by men with too much whiskey. They spoke of pale figures moving like shadows, of sons who laughed at nothing, of brothers chanting in the woods when the moon was high. Despite these rumors, no one acted. County officials who came to investigate were met with silence and resistance. Neighbors told them, "Best to leave those men alone. The mountain keeps its own secrets." Even the church remained quiet. Ministers preached about sin in general terms, but never named the Brotherhood directly. Some claimed fear held their tongues. Others muttered that donations from nearby clans kept sermons restrained. The silence of the church was particularly damning. In communities where ministers often condemned every small vice, their refusal to address the Brotherhood spoke volumes. Men saw the pulpit bend beneath the weight of fear. There were darker rumors still. Whispers claimed that certain outsiders, desperate or drunk, sought out the Brotherhood's land, offering coins or goods in exchange for unspeakable arrangements. If true, that tied outsiders into the cycle itself. If those stories held any truth, then neighbors were not just complicit by silence. They were participants, bound by shame to keep the Brotherhood hidden. Silence became not only fear, but self-preservation. The cost of silence was clear. Each new generation of sons was born weaker, more haunted, yet still the cycle continued unbroken. And the men who lived nearby looked away, shaking their heads but doing nothing. In that way, the community became an accomplice. By ignoring what they saw, they allowed the chain to lengthen. By refusing to speak, they gave permission for the Brotherhood to collapse further into secrecy. Some men justified their silence with fatalism. "It's their business," they said. "Always been that way." Others claimed interference would anger the mountains themselves, as though nature defended the Brotherhood's dark ritual. But in truth, silence was cowardice. Neighbors feared retaliation, feared being cursed, feared losing land or reputation. So they traded conscience for quiet, allowing generations of boys to suffer in isolation. The Brotherhood knew this silence worked in their favor. Every rifle displayed, every glare from a porch, reinforced the unspoken message: outsiders will not interfere. Neighbors accepted that warning, retreating into complicity. Thus, the men of nearby towns became shadows themselves, silent witnesses to tragedy. Their refusal to act gave the Brotherhood power, and that power ensured the chain would not break. Silence was the loudest weapon of all. In the end, the neighbor's silence is as haunting as the brotherhood itself. For without silence, the chain could never have endured. It was complicity, not ignorance, that allowed 7 generations to pass unchallenged. What began as survival slowly hardened into law. The Brotherhood's earliest choices may have been desperate, born from isolation, but over generations those choices transformed into commandments enforced with the same weight as Scripture. Inside cabins, fathers repeated the same lessons. Sons were told the world outside was corrupt, that outsiders sought to steal land, dishonor blood, and destroy heritage. Loyalty to brothers became sacred truth, never questioned, always obeyed. The earliest unions may have been whispered out of necessity, but by the 5th generation they were celebrated as destiny. Fires burned in the hollows as brothers renewed their oaths, declaring purity above all else. Neighbors reported strange gatherings at night, low voices carried across the trees, hymns twisted into unfamiliar chants, oaths spoken in unison. Whether real rituals or drunken chants, the message was the same. The brotherhood was bound by more than blood. In these ceremonies, sons learned their place. They were reminded that to betray their bloodline by joining outsiders was to condemn generations of forefathers. The weight of guilt was placed upon boys long before manhood. Ritual transformed suffering into pride. A son born frail or marked by deformity was not pitied, but praised as evidence that the chain endured. Weakness itself became proof of loyalty, twisted into a badge of honor. This doctrine gave fathers control. They no longer had to convince sons with logic or reason. Instead, they invoked tradition as law. To defy the bond was to defy ancestors, and to defy ancestors was unthinkable. By then, the cabins had become sanctuaries of isolation. Men rarely entered towns, rarely traded goods, rarely spoke with outsiders. Their lives revolved around rituals that reinforced doctrine, tightening the chain with each passing year. Generations of sons grew up not knowing alternatives. They were taught that brotherhood was holy, outsiders were threats, and suffering was righteous. Choices vanished, only obedience remained. Tradition had calcified into unshakable law. Neighbors, too, noticed the change. What once appeared as stubbornness had become something darker, almost religious. Outsiders whispered that the brotherhood worshipped its own blood, that loyalty had become an idol raised higher than reason itself. Within the cabins, men believed those whispers were true. They spoke of themselves as chosen, different from others, untouchable. Pride swelled, even as bodies weakened. They convinced themselves suffering was divine rather than tragic. This transformation carried danger beyond the mountains. Pride fueled hostility. Outsiders who dared trespass were confronted by brothers united in doctrine. Their silence had become more than defense. It was armed resistance, rooted in sacred conviction. The irony was cruel. What began as survival, an attempt to remain hidden and safe, had evolved into bondage. Sons were trapped, their futures predetermined, their lives chained to an oath no man could escape. Fathers justified everything with doctrine. "This is how it has always been," they declared. "This is how it must remain." Their words echoed like scripture, pressed into boys until doubt itself seemed like sin. By the 6th generation, rituals defined life. Sons were initiated into oaths with firelight, chants, and blood. Each ceremony reinforced pride, transforming what outsiders saw as curse into what the brotherhood celebrated as holy legacy. Even as fields failed and cabins rotted, the doctrine held stronger than timber. Men clung to pride as though it were survival itself, convinced that breaking tradition would erase everything their ancestors had endured. What had begun as secrecy now ruled as law. The brotherhood was no longer just a bloodline, it was a creed. And like all creeds built on fear, it demanded loyalty unto death. Thus, survival twisted into doctrine, and doctrine became prison. Sons were no longer merely inheritors of blood. They were disciples of a faith that demanded suffering, obedience, and silence in the name of brotherhood. The mountains held secrets, but secrets rarely stayed silent forever. Hunters, travelers, and wanderers returned with unsettling stories. Rumors drifted through taverns and campfires, shaping a legend around the brotherhood that felt both unbelievable and undeniable. Men swore they glimpsed pale figures at twilight. Brothers stood motionless at the tree line, watching with wide eyes that caught moonlight unnaturally. Some claimed they vanished as quickly as they appeared, like phantoms born of shadow. Others reported laughter echoing without source, shrill and unsettling. In the stillness of the hollows, sudden bursts of sound carried unnaturally far. Outsiders returned shaken, muttering that the mountains themselves seemed haunted by voices of boys. There were tales of hunters followed through the forest. Footsteps crunched behind them, but no pursuer was seen. Some described guttural noises, half growl, half cry, that sent hardened woodsmen fleeing from paths they once trusted. In taverns, these accounts became drinking stories. Men leaned close, lowering their voices, retelling encounters as if speaking too loudly would summon the brotherhood. Each retelling grew darker, blending fact and imagination until no one knew where truth ended. Some whispered about rituals in the woods. They spoke of fires burning at midnight, rings of men chanting, and blood spilled upon the ground. Whether these rituals truly occurred or not, the stories stuck, fueling fear. There were darker rumors, too. Outsiders claimed desperate men from nearby towns sought the brotherhood for forbidden arrangements, trading goods or coin for silence. Such whispers suggested outsiders themselves became entangled in the secrecy of the chain. These rumors made the brotherhood untouchable. Fear kept officials away. Curiosity was muted by dread. Who would risk entering cabins where laughter became screams, where shadows moved unnaturally, and where every son mirrored his brother too closely? Over time, echoes of the brotherhood became folklore. Fathers warned their sons not to wander too deep into the hills, claiming pale figures would steal them away, binding them forever to the cursed chain. For outsiders, the brotherhood became more myth than reality. Some dismissed the tales as drunken exaggeration, yet the persistence of stories kept fear alive. Men rarely challenged legends when too many details repeated. Yet the strangest part of these rumors was their consistency. Generations apart, men told nearly identical stories. Wide eyes, twisted faces, cries in the night, and figures moving silently between trees. Legends repeated like the bloodline itself. For the brotherhood, these whispers served as protection. Fear discouraged intrusion. Every rumor of haunting, every tale of cursed men strengthened their wall of isolation, ensuring outsiders left them to their rituals undisturbed. But echoes also carried truth. Strange photographs surfaced. Sepia portraits of sons whose features were disturbingly alike, as though stamped from the same mold. County records documented births and deaths, silent testimony supporting the darkest whispers. Even so, locals avoided naming the brotherhood aloud. They referred to them with vague phrases, "those men in the hollows," or "the ones up in the ridge." Names were avoided, as though words themselves carried danger. In this silence, rumors thrived. Stories became currency, traded between men who never dared venture close. The brotherhood lived as both flesh and legend, hidden yet ever present, haunting the imagination of every settlement nearby. The power of rumor was greater than any rifle. Outsiders kept their distance not because of law, but because of belief. Belief that stepping too close meant never returning unchanged. Thus, echoes and rumors became another chain. They trapped the brotherhood in legend while protecting them from intrusion. The silence of neighbors and the fear of outsiders combined, ensuring 7 generations endured under a veil of myth. By the 7th generation, the chain began to break under its own weight. The oath that once bound brothers in pride now revealed its terrible cost. Sons were born weaker, sicker, and fewer survived beyond childhood. Cabins that once echoed with chants fell into silence. Roofs sagged, fields went barren, and stray animals wandered freely where boys once played. The land itself seemed to mirror the failing strength of the brotherhood. Doctors in nearby counties recorded strange conditions. They wrote about boys born without strength to walk, men crippled before middle age, and minds clouded beyond recognition. Yet the cause was left unwritten, a truth too dangerous to state. Fathers could no longer deny reality. The doctrine demanded pride, but the evidence of collapse was undeniable. Sons were buried too often, and those who lived struggled to carry the chain forward, their bodies betraying them. Some men attempted escape. A few left the mountains entirely, drifting into nearby towns. But the chain followed them. Records show short-lived unions, abandoned sons, and early deaths. It seemed the curse clung to blood wherever it went. By then, the Brotherhood's land had fallen to ruin. Cabins rotted, fences collapsed, and fields grew wild. Outsiders who wandered near described ghostly settlements, empty shells of once guarded strongholds, now surrendered to decay and silence. The men who remained grew gaunt, hollow-eyed, and suspicious of all contact. Their rifles still leaned by the doors, but their strength to wield them faded. The oath that once commanded fear now inspired pity. Whispers spread in nearby towns that the Brotherhood was finished. Hunters reported fewer sightings, officials recorded fewer births, and tavern rumors shifted from fear to curiosity. Men wondered aloud if the chain had finally reached its end. Yet some insisted the Brotherhood still lingered. They swore they saw pale figures moving silently through abandoned fields. Eyes glimmered from the tree line, watching but never approaching. The legend refused to die, even as the bloodline weakened. The collapse was not sudden. It was slow, relentless, inevitable. Each new generation bore more weakness, more silence, more shadows of men who could no longer carry the burden forced upon them. Neighbors noted the change. Where once the Brotherhood had inspired dread, now it inspired sorrow. Men shook their heads and muttered, "They should have let the chain break long ago." But it was too late. Fathers still tried to enforce the oath. They told sons, "You must continue, as we always have." But their words carried less force. Pride could not disguise the cracks spreading through the lineage. Some sons resisted quietly. They wandered deeper into towns, seeking work or drink, desperate for a life outside the hollows. Yet wherever they went, their faces betrayed them, marked by unmistakable resemblance to the Brotherhood. Those who escaped often met tragic ends. They carried both stigma and sickness, unable to blend fully into outside life. Abandoned sons appeared in orphanages, their origins whispered but never recorded, as though history itself wished to erase them. By mid-century, the Brotherhood settlements were shadows of themselves. Cabins stood empty, weeds overtook paths, and silence pressed heavy. The once feared chain had rusted, its links weakened by generations of suffering and secrecy. Men who studied records later concluded the bloodline had consumed itself. Pride had transformed into collapse, tradition into ruin. The Brotherhood that once enforced silence upon outsiders had now silenced itself forever. And yet, even in collapse, echoes lingered. Some descendants walked among nearby towns, their faces carrying faint reminders of the oath. Others vanished entirely, swallowed by unmarked graves. But the memory of the chain still haunted the mountains. The Brotherhood had collapsed, but its story remained, a warning carved into silence, reminding all who heard it that when men bind themselves to tradition without mercy, the chain they forge will eventually strangle them. Even after the Brotherhood's collapse, silence lingered across the mountains. Men who lived nearby rarely spoke of what they had witnessed. Generations passed, yet the memory of those brothers clung like smoke after fire. County records, brittle and yellowed, tell fragments of the story. Births and deaths documented in shaky handwriting. Coroner notes mentioning frailty without cause. Marriage ledgers recording bonds that outsiders dared not speak aloud. Silence filled every margin. Photographs survived too, faces staring from sepia frames, each nearly identical. Narrow jaws, wide-set eyes, and haunting stares mirrored across brothers, fathers, and sons. The images felt less like portraits and more like echoes repeating endlessly. Abandoned cabins still stand in certain hollows, roofs caved in, vines claiming walls, hearths cold for decades. Men who stumble upon them whisper of shadows at the windows, convinced the Brotherhood still lingers in silence. Some descendants scattered into towns, their origins whispered but unspoken. Their faces carried faint traces of the chain, features too familiar to ignore. Neighbors recognized them but chose not to ask, allowing silence to continue. Legends replaced facts. Fathers warned sons not to wander too far into the woods, telling tales of pale watchers. Whether real or imagined, those stories ensured the Brotherhood remained alive in memory long after collapse. Historians studying the records concluded the bloodline had been destroyed by its own determination. Isolation turned into ritual, ritual into doctrine, and doctrine into ruin. Pride had consumed itself until nothing but silence remained. Yet silence was not innocent. It was enforced by neighbors who looked away, ministers who avoided naming names, and officials who refused to interfere. The Brotherhood's survival was not only internal, it was enabled by a community's complicity. This complicity is the darkest legacy. For 7 generations, men outside the hollows chose comfort over courage. They let boys suffer, allowed fathers to enforce chains, and turned whispers into myths rather than confront the truth. Even today, locals hesitate to speak openly. They shake their heads, muttering, "Best left alone." The silence feels inherited, passed down like land or tools. It has become part of the mountains themselves, heavy and unbroken. Researchers call it a cautionary tale. They warn that secrecy breeds tragedy, and that when men place pride above love, destruction follows. The Brotherhood is remembered less as anomaly and more as mirror for human nature. For in every community, silence exists. Men ignore what they fear to face. They look away from suffering, convincing themselves it is not their responsibility. The story of the Brotherhood is simply that silence taken to extremes. Some descendants may still walk among us, unnoticed, yet marked by subtle resemblance. Their existence reminds us that history never disappears completely. It lingers in blood, in faces, in whispers that refuse to fade. The true horror of the Brotherhood is not deformity, not rituals, not decay. It is the silence of those who knew and did nothing, a silence louder than screams, heavier than chains. The legacy of silence warns us that complicity is as dangerous as cruelty. To look away is to participate. To ignore suffering is to feed it. This truth stretches far beyond the Appalachian hills. Every chain eventually breaks, but the memory of its weight endures. The Brotherhood may have collapsed, but its silence still binds those who refuse to speak uncomfortable truths. That silence is the true inheritance of the mountains. And so the Brotherhood lives on, not in blood, but in the lesson it left behind. Pride without mercy becomes destruction. Tradition without compassion becomes prison. And silence, when chosen by men, becomes the loudest curse of all.